the Anbernic RG34XXS forehead. A tribute to the past and a pillar of the... This could be one of the most important handhelds of all time. Look at the forehead. Bro, why is it so big? Now, what is the RG34XXSP? Well, this is Anbernic's latest clamshell handheld, a Game Boy Advance SP style handheld with twin analog sticks and a 3:2 aspect ratio screen. So it perfectly scales GBA games to 3 times their original resolution. The 34XXSP is the sequel to Anbernic's 35XXSP, a slightly larger folding handheld that was one of the most popular retro handhelds of 2024. The newer edition is more compact, even higher quality, and arguably more versatile too, since it has those analog sticks. But the 3:2 aspect ratio display might not be as versatile as you'd think, since many retro systems were designed for taller 4:3 aspect ratio displays. And on top of that, literally, there's a massive forehead-shaped elephant in the room that can't be ignored. So in this video, we're going to explore the Anbernic RG34XXSP, take a look at all the different features, play some games on it, and decide if this is the clamshell for you. There's only one way to find out, so let's dive in. So here we have the box for the Anbernic RG34XXSP. Off the bat, they're flexing their McDonald's yellow Pikachu colorway here, and on the bottom we can see all the other colors. It comes in yellow, gray, black, and indigo, the one that we'll be looking at. Sometimes you just gotta give it a good smack, you know what I'm saying? Oh man, let's put this to the side and we'll take a look at what else is going on in here. I actually appreciate that they put an online play section in here. This is a big thing that I recommend more people try out if you got friends, because all of us have friends, right? We all got friends. And we have a screen protector. It's actually not too bad. It's pretty decent quality. It's not too flimsy and it's pretty crisp. And a USB A to C cable, usual stuff. So here is the 34XXSP. Immediate thoughts are it feels so much more like an original Game Boy Advance SP. The 35XXSP was a little bit too big to evoke Game Boy Advance nostalgia. It just kind of felt like, you know, Bizarro World, alternate universe, the chunky universe, whereas the 34XXSP feels much more natural and familiar. I really like the texture on here. It's not too sleek and also not too matte. It finds a nice middle ground, and so far, great impressions. Now the weight and general build quality of this handheld feel very solid. Doesn't feel like it weighs too much, but it also doesn't feel light, like you'd accidentally snap it in half if you sat on it or something. It's right in the middle, and it rides that line quite well. Now let's take a look at how the 34XXSP compares to some other devices that you might be more familiar with. First up is a handheld that's very similar in many ways, the 35XXSP. This one has a 3.5-inch 4:3 aspect ratio screen. The 34XXSP is considerably smaller than the 3.5. And Game Boy Advance games are actually larger on the 3.4 because it has the same aspect ratio display. And also the 34SP is significantly thinner than the 35XXSP, which is kind of a chonker. Moving on to another handheld that's very similar, the MiiU Flip. It's almost the exact same size as the 34XXSP, but a little more rounded at the edges, so it feels a little smaller. It also has extremely shallow shoulder buttons compared to the 34XXSP. Here's how the 34SP compares to an original Nintendo 3DS, Ambassador Edition. The 34SP is a little more than half the length of the 3DS, but a little taller too. But the 3DS is much thinner than the SP. And here's how it stacks up to the non-clamshell RG34XX. They both have the same exact screen, but the 34XX has a black bezel. The 34XX is a bit thick and curvy compared to the SP. And here's a couple speed round comparisons. Here's a trim UI brick. A Game Boy Color is slightly shorter than the SP when it's flipped out. And if you're wondering, here's how it compares to a Game Boy Color cartridge. Custom shell Xbox Series controller for scale. An iPhone 13 Pro is slightly shorter than the SP when it's fully flipped out. The SP is the size of about 2 AirPod Pro 2 cases. And as always, get a Steam Deck, bro. Opening it up, man, that hinge is snappy. It is so snappy and powerful without being totally overdone. We have a double hinge design, and this forehead is stashing a magnet. So all of those kind of come together to create a very seamless and sturdy hinge. It has enough friction to stay open at pretty much any angle until around 135 degrees. That's when it flings open to that first hinge point. But you can set it at 90, you can set it at a weird angle if you're like sitting below the table. It can stick right around here at what seems to be 110 degrees. Anything past that, kind of flings back. But this first hinge point feels quite natural. Theoretically, you can play with the hinge all the way back, but most likely it'll just pop right back up. So that's the one downside to this hinge, is it has a little bit of bias for that first hinge point, and it kind of relies on gravity to keep it all the way back. If you just kind of flick your hands a little bit, pops right back to that hinge point. Now that we've taken a full Hinge 101 course, let's talk about these shoulder buttons on the back. We have 4 inline shoulder buttons, with L2 and R2 being slightly raised above the L1 and R1 buttons. So this leads to a much more comfortable and natural finger placement and less accidental button presses. The shoulder buttons are decent overall. They're tactile and clicky with a nice conformation. It's very satisfying. The shoulder buttons rest a bit high on the device, and they have a good amount of travel to them too. L2 and R2 are slightly more raised and a bit of a reach compared to the outer bumpers L1 and R1. If you're playing Game Boy Advance games, you'll primarily just be using these outer shoulder buttons. Pressing them down can sometimes feel inconsistent and unpredictable in the pressure required to bottom out. They're also very loud and clicky, which is nice if you like the clicky response, but not nice for gaming around other people. These face buttons feel fantastic. They don't travel a whole lot, and they sit pretty low on the device, but they have a very satisfying press to them. The plastic is a bit hard and firm, but the presses are soft and tactile. I would love these buttons on any budget handheld. They feel pretty dang good. I really wish that they made this a GameCube colorway with the green and red AB buttons, the gray X and Y, and then the yellow C stick. That would have been perfect. Moving over to the D-pad, it's precise and tactile. It's your typical dome switch style D-pad, so these ones are excellent for precision platformers and fighting games. I wish that the plastic was a little softer, and if it bottomed out, this would have been an A+. So I'd give it a B+. It's not perfect, but it's not too far behind. Now let's move down to these twin analog sticks. The analog sticks are pretty great for a clamshell handheld. They have a soft rubber coating that grips your thumb a little bit, but intense games like first-person shooters or ARPGs may have your thumb slipping and sliding around. This is a budget device, so they're not super premium and they definitely don't sound like it, but they feel good. The sticks have your classic, practically trademarked Anbernic cardinal snapping, so the movement feels less fluid and more like an N64 analog stick, with the 8-way direction snapping. The placement of the sticks also seems to be more out of necessity than comfort, so they're not the most comfortable to use for longer gaming sessions. But with all that said, I'd still consider them good sticks for this device. However, they're nothing more than nice to have, use them occasionally kind of thumbsticks. I would not recommend being a thumbstick main on this specific handheld. Now let's take a look at the rest of the handheld here. On the left side, we have a very satisfying volume rocker, a microSD card slot with a 64GB unbranded card included, and a sneaky hole at the bottom for lanyards and charms. Underneath, we have nothing but a centered headphone jack that just kind of looks goofy and It feels anatomical in a way. On the right side, we have a power button, reset button, and a secondary micro SD card slot. This is where you should stash all of your ROMs. And on top, we have 4 inline shoulder buttons, and in between them, a USB OTG port for charging and data, and a mini HDMI slot for video out. So you will need to get a mini HDMI to regular HDMI adapter to use that. But as soon as you get that, you can just connect a Bluetooth controller and start playing. And nothing underneath outside of a stacked lines texture. So now let's turn this thing on and see how this 3.4-inch display looks. The time it takes this handheld to turn on is a little over 21 seconds, which I'd say is pretty decent. This is the average boot on time for a Linux handheld like this. If we were looking at 25 to 30 seconds, I'd consider that to be a little too slow, but 21 seconds is good. That being said, this is also a clamshell, so we can just close it when we want to stop gaming, and it'll go to sleep mode automatically. And then within under a second, you can just pop it right open, and voila, we are right back in it exactly where we left off. It's very convenient and kind of the highlight of a clamshell handheld like this. It's perfectly built for gaming on the go. Normal standby mode drains about 1% battery every 2 hours or so. That could vary depending on what settings you have enabled, like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, what game you're playing maybe, but that's a good ballpark, around 1% every 2 hours or 12% per day. That should give you about a week of standby time, maybe a little more, pretty decent for a clamshell like this. Looking at this display, I'd say it's quite good. Not necessarily the brightest or most crisp display. This isn't gonna blow your mind. What is interesting is the forehead up here, because the screen is off center and it feels like they're hiding screen up there, but they're not. They're hiding a magnet for the closing of the lid. Honestly, the display should have just been centered. The fact that it's off center really makes that big ass forehead stand out. While we all love retro, I think Anbernic went a little too retro with the size of these bezels, you know what I'm saying? Looking closer at the display, you can see it's kind of inset with a taller bezel at the top and shorter bezels on the bottom and sides. Now, while the size of the top part is a bit jarring, I think the more that you play games on here, the more you forget about that because you're focused more on the game as opposed to the forehead. But the downside of this is if we want to play any other consoles, they're usually going to be 4:3 aspect ratio. So we'll get what's called pillar boxing, where you can see on the sides we have that little PS1 type overlay there. If you get rid of that, it'll just be black. We can stretch these games out a little bit, and it will look a little bit wide and kind of weird. And that's kind of the compromise of a 3:2 aspect ratio display like this, is it's perfect for Game Boy Advance, and you can also do PSP games pretty well, but every other console that is 4:3 is not gonna be ideal. So on paper, it's a 3.4-inch display. But after the whole pillar boxing, playing any of these systems that are designed for 4:3 will lead you with basically a 3.1-inch display. That's kind of a big difference compared to a lot of other handhelds. Now let's talk about what you can expect from the out-of-the-box software experience. Anbernic has really improved their operating system experience, including ports and box art scraping. I'd say the biggest thing to be aware of with Anbernic OS is you have 2 options here to play games: Game Rooms and RA Game, which stands for RetroArch. It's basically 2 entirely different emulators. One is a hub for a bunch of emulator cores, and these ones are standalone emulators. The standalone ones might give you better performance, but it really depends on the game. When you decide to play a game, I'd recommend favoriting it, because if you play it in RA Game and then accidentally load it up in Game Rooms, you're not gonna have your save, because the saves don't really transfer between the 2. So in order to continue your progress in a game, you need to play it in the same emulator, like RA Game for playing it in RetroArch, or Game Rooms for playing it in standalone emulators. It's a very easy mistake to make, and I've done it plenty times in the past. Now that we've looked at all of the features of this device, let's load some games on here to see how they look, play, and feel on the RG34XXSP. Quick disclaimer before we get into it, we're using all of our own ROMs for testing. I didn't like the numbered ROM set, so we're just gonna load our own games onto it. And we're also playing all of these using a custom build of MuOS Pixie. So there's a couple systems where the border overlay isn't displaying by default, so it might just be because of that. Now let's check out some games. Starting off with Super Nintendo, we got Yoshi's Island, a classic. You know it, you love it, it's solid. It doesn't stretch to fill the screen by default, so you do get this pillar boxing due to the wider aspect ratio screen. So if you do want to play full screen, then you gotta stretch it a little bit. Now the controls felt really good and crisp. The D-pad is very responsive and the buttons are tactile and satisfying. Really enjoyed playing this one. Moving on to F-Zero, this one also played really great. The controls were very responsive and the D-pad is just tight, I guess. Me, on the other hand, I was also tight. Wait, that's right, I was 100% locked in. Fully dialed, I locked it in and I threw away the key, you know what I'm saying? Just ignore the rough start and junior difficulty. Moving on to Game Boy Color, Tokitori was a lot of fun. It's a chill platformer, but I decided to try and speed run some levels for this footage. The game actually looked great with the Game Boy Color border and RetroArch. And I don't know if you knew this, but Zelda Tears of the Kingdom actually borrowed their mechanics from this world-renowned puzzle platformer. So in a way, we kinda have Tokitori to thank for Tears of the Kingdom. Just saying. Next up is another Game Boy Color banger, Pokemon Prism. It's a Pokemon Crystal ROM hack that's pretty solid overall. Again, this is a custom build of a custom firmware, so there's probably a better option at this point. But in terms of the gameplay, the quality of life improvements like fast forward and save state made this a breeze to play. I definitely recommend checking it out if you want a fresh take on Gen 2 Pokemon. And now for the system we've all been waiting for, Dreamcast! Just kidding, we'll get to that later. For now, we got Game Boy Advance. That's kind of what this thing was made for. We get pixel perfect 3x upscale, so Game Boy Advance games look perfectly crisp and they fill up the screen too. So just like you'd expect, GBA games feel right at home on here. And honestly, the analog sticks aren't too distracting when you're actually playing these GBA games. First up here, we have a game that I've been absolutely addicted to lately, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow Reprise. This is a ROM hack of Aria of Sorrow that turns it into a roguelike with randomizer elements too. So it makes the game extremely fresh, very pick up and play, and also adds the roguelike stakes to it, where if you die, you have to start the run over. The controls here are, again, incredibly crisp. The D-pad is practically designed for these more precise side-scrolling games like Castlevania. I'd highly recommend giving this game a play if you want a refreshing take on the Castlevania Aria of Sorrow experience. You know it, you love it, it's Metroid Zero Mission. As soon as I launched this one, felt the controls and saw the big crisp visuals, I was instantly hyped. This is an excellent way to play Metroid. Everything just felt perfect on here. The control layout, the tactility of the front-facing buttons, and even the clickiness of the shoulder buttons, they all just felt right at home. So I really enjoyed playing Metroid Zero Mission on the 34XXSP. Of course, we had to do it to him. Zelda Minish Cap, again, really colorful and crisp, especially because it fills up this 3:2 aspect ratio screen. Really nothing to complain about here. And you also get that fast forward feature to skip through those really long Minish Cap cutscenes. And you can't have a Game Boy Advance clamshell without some Game Boy Advance Pokemon. Here we have Pokemon Emerald Sea Glass. This game looks gorgeous. The art style is also really nice with a nostalgic but refreshing palette. The fast forward feature is a must for breezing through these Pokemon games, and the battles are solid too. But there's this flicker at the end of every turn. That's just the sprite's refreshing, or in other words, a refreshing sprite.
Want a Sprite cranberry?
This refreshing sprite mechanism is a way to prevent crashing and freezing. I thought it was an emulation bug, but the developers said that it was intentional, so I guess you just gotta deal with it with Emerald Sea Glass. Either way, maybe check it out. Now let's move up a generation to Nintendo DS. I was surprisingly satisfied playing DS games on here because the 3x2 display has just enough room for a smaller, lower screen, so you can see if there's a prompt or menu on there. It actually makes playing DS games significantly more convenient and enjoyable. And if you don't like that bottom screen, then you can just play single screen and center the display. Plus, the analog sticks make touch inputs really convenient compared to D-pad only devices. It's just much more versatile than I was expecting. So I'd give DS a solid B on here, compared to most 4x3 handhelds where it's more like a C grade. Now in light of the $80 Mario Kart world, we're taking it back to the classics with Mario Kart DS. This was just really fun overall. I feel like this overlay might be a little divisive because the primary screen is off center, but it feels really good to have that tiny second screen there just in case something pops up on it. And as usual, the controls were crisp and comfortable and the screen looked good. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow Definitive Edition Plus is a banger. Absolutely fantastic game with an insanely good soundtrack and super sweet visuals too. Speaking of those visuals, this Definitive Edition Plus leans a little more into the muted color palette. So if you like that kind of aesthetic with a lot of other quality of life improvements, I'd highly recommend checking out the Definitive Edition Plus. Etrian Odyssey was a game, for sure. I thought it was just a first-person dungeon crawler, but the mapping system was painful. My hands were constantly cramping up trying to painstakingly map using the thumbstick to control the stylus. When you make a mistake, you have to erase the mistake with the same amount of precision, so erasing was just as brutal. Just a bad experience. I would not recommend precision touchscreen games on here at all. The sticks are great in a pinch, but they're not great for precise movement. Now let's hop over to home consoles, starting with Nintendo 64. N64 pushes the performance quite a bit, and it needs a little bit of tweaking to get right. During the gameplay capture here, I was using the standalone MuOS 64 emulator with the Rice plugin, since it ran significantly smoother than the other emulators. But since then, I switched over to the Parallel 64 core within RetroArch, because it also supports the Rice plugin, which gives us that really smooth performance, and it has all the control remapping and customizing options that come with RetroArch as well. So that's kind of been the best of both worlds for me. All you need to know is that within MuOS, the best N64 options are either Parallel 64 with the Rice plugin or MuOS 64 standalone. Now let's check out some performance. Super Mario 64 was pretty good overall. We're running it in a wild RetroArch configuration that I don't know what possessed me to do. I did Glide N64 plugin instead of the Rice that I was just talking about. Either way, it ran perfectly as it does on most N64 emulators. I increased the resolution and stretched it to fill the screen because I'm a dirty dog. And I also swapped the Z and L buttons to make playing it a little more comfortable. And of course, what's an N64 showcase without Banjo-Kazooie? This was pretty solid. I'm playing this one in the standalone emulator, which doesn't have a settings menu, so you can't change the default controls, which made it pretty crampy to use L2 as the Z button and just not an ideal experience. Since then, like I mentioned, I switched over to Parallel 64 for the emulation core, and after throwing it on the Rice plugin and configuring my controls, everything just feels so much better now. So rest assured, N64 is decent on here. It's not perfect. Next up, it's the console that could have been. It came out a little too early and a little too late. It's the Dreamcast. Dreamcast emulation is similar to N64 on here, but with even less optimization. You might get a couple games running okay, but don't expect much more than that. The first level of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 runs great, then performance takes a serious nosedive in the following levels. The frame rate tanks in all of the subsequent levels, with big open areas especially. And it's practically begging for mercy when you hit any of the career goals on top of that. I would just stick to the PS1 versions of these games. Speaking of PS1, let's check out some PS1 games. PS1 is great on here, but just like previous 4x3 aspect ratio systems, you'll either need to play with pillar boxing or join the dark side and become a dastardly stretcher. Crash 3 Warped was absolutely fantastic. I I use this game to test the precision of the D-pad because if a D-pad's kind of mushy or squishy, Crash flies all over the place. Or in more technical terms, Crash is moving like he's off a beam, bro. But on the 34XXSP, I had no problems with the D-pad precision at all, and everything felt extremely accurate and responsive. And of course, when it comes to the aspect ratio, you know I had to stretch it on him. But it was only after recording that I realized I didn't stretch it all the way vertically, so I guess as a great philosopher once said, damn, that's tough, bro. And Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 was an absolute vibe. I really wish that this could run the GameCube or PS2 version, but PS1 version is not bad. As usual, the controls and visuals were great. And also as usual, I stretched that bad boy out to 3x2, but I also tweaked the emulation clock to set it at 100% so the game runs a little bit smoother. I'm still learning the dark arts of PS1 emulation, especially trying to squeeze the most juice out of it and get them to feel smoother. That being said, you know, I still had to throw down because I'm kind of a sweaty Tony Hawk player. If they dropped the Tony Hawk rank system, I would be absolutely farming MMR. Anyway, speaking of not MMR, let's move on to PlayStation Portable. Kicking it off for PSP, we have Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories. Now, since Anbernic showed off Vice City Stories on the PSP, I decided to try out Liberty City Stories instead, and it was bad. Certainly playable, but only with automatic frame skip enabled. There's parts of the city that run at 30 FPS and others barely scraping past 15 FPS. I wouldn't consider this a PSP device. It can't really run Grand Theft Auto well without a bunch of tweaks and hacks. And don't even think about running God of War on here because it's practically a slideshow. And this next game was an absolute wreck because it's Burnout, baby. Burnout Legends was practically perfect. I didn't notice much slowdown at all, even with frame skip disabled. The gameplay is so good and the controls were solid as well. It was just a super immersive experience. And finally, I want to show you some native ports using Portmaster. Ports are what I'd consider the soul food of these low-end handhelds. They're just so fucking tasty, and they feel handmade for these systems. Some of them will need the original game files to work, and they might take some tinkering to get running, but when you finally get a port working, it feels like magic. Playing games like Half-Life, Majora's Mask, PokeMMO, SteamWorld Dig, and Hyperlight Drifter, and more keep coming out every week. They just really elevate the entire handheld experience and make these budget devices pretty compelling. Now, Half-Life runs flawlessly from a performance standpoint. The controls can get a little crampy with the analog sticks and the shoulder buttons, and precise aiming and movement is kind of a crapshoot, but this is still a pretty fun way to play Half-Life on the go. One great thing about the 34XXSP is because we have built-in Wi-Fi, we can actually play PokeMMO on the go. It was recently ported to Portmaster, so after a little bit of setup, we can get PokeMMO running perfectly. The performance is very solid. Controls are pretty intuitive overall, and the analog sticks help get through any on-screen prompts too. Although the gameplay can be a little grindy, it's still a really fun and chill game. Definitely something to kick back and relax to. Hyperlight Drifter is a very interesting one. This port only runs on powerful devices, and while the 34XXSP isn't what I'd consider a powerful device, the 2 GB of RAM lets us play these harder to run games. This one in particular runs surprisingly well for the most part. I played the first 30 minutes off camera and there was a couple slowdowns, but it ran great while I was filming. Even during some intense combat, it still kept up. SteamWorld Dig 2 has been a huge standout for me. This game looks absolutely gorgeous on the 34XXSP's display. It's so colorful and crisp, and it fills up the entire display. It's just a very beautiful game, and the screen gets just bright enough to look good in most conditions. And as always, it ain't a Montotech game test without some Zelda Majora's Mask. But because we're in the Portmaster section, this is a native port called Ship of Harkinian 2. This game runs perfectly outside of an occasional single frame drop here and there. We've got it at 30 frames per second, just like the 3DS remake, and we're using a high-resolution texture pack as well. Playing a game like Majora's Mask, any of my gripes with this handheld kinda just fizzle away, and I really enjoy the gaming, which is a great sign. It's certainly not perfect, but it's really enjoyable. And I really love having a versatile handheld that can run ports like this too. So if you do pick up a 34XX SP, you gotta get Majora's Mask on there using 2-ship 2 Harkinian. So as we saw, performance is definitely performing sometimes. It's pretty much the exact same performance as every other XX device that Anbernic has released, and that's 11 so far, maybe more by the time you watch this video. Anbernic is just constantly pumping out the same H700 chipset that's inside of here and just putting it on every other handheld, so the performance is nothing new. The only thing that is new is the 2 GB of RAM. So theoretically that would help us do PSP better and Portmaster better. One of those is true, the Portmaster one. PSP is still not great. So it's kind of a mixed bag with this one. I mean, for a budget handheld, I'm pretty satisfied with the performance that we're getting out of here, especially knowing that PSP, Dreamcast, N64, and Portmaster are all bonus consoles. The rest of what runs on here is very solid. For everything else like Game Boy Advance, PS1, Super NES, I mean, everything else is just very good and solid and reliable. This is like a mashed potatoes handheld. It's not fully loaded, it's just mashed potatoes. So it fills you up, gets the job done, but it's not anything special. But you might like it, and you probably will like it. Anyways, what was I saying? Oh yeah, performance, it's good. However, ports have been a ton of fun on here. Having the versatility of 2 analog sticks, a wider display than 4x3, and the clamshell ease of use just make it a fantastic Portmaster device. So that kind of makes the 34XX just a little bit special and a little bit better than the other XX devices. If you're willing to settle with this 3x2 aspect ratio screen, that's kind of the kicker here, right? It's a bit of a weird trade-off. But this is also a Romhacks machine. There's so many different Romhacks like Pokemon Lazarus, Emerald Sea Glass, Castlevania, Metroid, just the list goes on and on. I'm a big hack head, I guess, but they're just an excellent way to experience these familiar yet new games. Now the size of the 34XX is pretty good overall, and a welcome improvement over its big brother, the 35XX. On camera, they kind of look very similar in size, right? Except the screen looks significantly smaller. I can tell you in person that this actually feels a lot smaller and more compact than the 35XX. Now, with this more compact profile, it can fit snugly in your pocket, and then you can flip it out to a very compact but solid handheld. Now, for some reason, it doesn't feel as rugged to me as the 35XX. And I think part of that just has to do with the smaller frame, and this just kind of feels solid. Like, I don't know, I kind of just want to chuck this at a wall. Not actually, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. But that honestly could just be placebo, and the fact that I have 2 backup 35XX in case the third one breaks. In general, the comfort of the 34XX varies depending on the games you're playing. D-pad centric games are pretty comfortable for a compact device. Single stick games are decent in a pinch, and twin stick games are just not a good time. They certainly work, but you'll be much more comfortable sticking to D-pad and single stick titles. The build quality of the 34XX is pretty good overall, but there's a couple areas where you can feel the budget cuts. The first is the inconsistency of the shoulder buttons. They're pretty loud and hollow feeling, with inconsistent pressure needed to activate them, especially on the L2 and R2 buttons. Then I have another, more specific problem. There's a very high-pitched coil whine that happens when I'm charging the device while it's turned on. Now the frequency is extremely high, so some people might not even be able to hear it. I can hear it clear as day, so I'm just kind of reporting my observations. Could be a simple fix, could be not a problem at all. I could be a little bit crazy, or all of the above. Either way, you know, don't shoot the messenger. Pew, pew. And finally, while the screen is pretty good, it's still lacking that extra brightness to stand out in brighter areas. Meanwhile, a device that actually does have that extra brightness would be something like the TrimUI Brick. That screen is just extremely crisp and bright. This one, not so much. It gets just bright enough to where most people will be satisfied in most scenarios, but it doesn't stand out from the pack. It just runs right in the middle. However, the asymmetric placement with the huge bezels really make it stand out, and it feels like it didn't exactly stick the landing. So I often find myself wanting to play games on a regular 4x3 handheld instead. And also part of me just looks at this and goes, what are you hiding up there? It's kind of like somebody wearing a really tall hat and you just kind of want to know what's going on in there. What you hiding in that hat? The answer is always magnets. Now, outside of hiding magnets in your hat, the display itself is solid, but nothing to write home about. It's a general improvement over previous Anbernic XX screens, but its unique 3x2 aspect ratio makes it perfect for a few consoles and lackluster in everything else. The more that I use this 3x2 aspect ratio display, the more I'm torn about its versatility. I think the big problem here is the big forehead. It feels like a reminder that we could have had extra screen real estate up there, but they chose to not do that, and now every 4x3 game feels smaller because of that. And that's kind of how I feel, like Pepsi Man here. That being said, Game Boy Advance is obviously perfect on here. And surprisingly enough, Nintendo DS is excellent on here too. Over on standard 4x3 aspect ratio displays, you can only see one DS screen at a time. Or you need to make the main DS screen smaller to have the other screen like in the corner or on the side, and then if it's on the side, then you'll have a big black bar at the bottom. It's just a much more compromised experience. However, on this 3x2 aspect ratio display, we have more room on the side, so that's an extra benefit of this wider screen. We got just enough room to put a tiny second screen, and then make it big by just pressing the back shoulder button. It's just a really great feature that I don't think a lot of people consider when looking at this device. And having those kind of weird analog sticks make touch prompts really convenient and super easy too. Check it out. All right, now that we've talked about the screen, let's check out the speaker on here and compare it to a device that's very similar in a lot of ways, the RG35XXSP. Now, the battery life is what I'd call good. It's just fine. You're not going to notice any extraordinary feats of gaming for 24 hours straight, but you probably won't have an issue with the battery life either. It doesn't stand out to me, which I'd say is a good thing for a budget handheld. The heat, on the other hand, is pretty noticeable, especially while charging or playing demanding systems. It's not bad, but it's there. So if you're sensitive to heat, you probably won't want to push this thing or play anything while it's charging. And if you're wondering, Game Boy Advance runs cool as a cucumber on here, at least until you charge the cucumber. But I don't think that you need to charge cucumbers. I don't know. I have a lot to think about. Now, connectivity is where things get a little interesting. This device has a surprising amount of connectivity and ports for a budget handheld. We've got Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, a headphone jack, and a mini HDMI slot, and a USB-C slot. And while none of those are earth-shattering on their own, having all of them on this one handheld is pretty nice. And the onboard Wi-Fi actually lets us do a couple pretty rad things. We can connect to retro achievements, use multiplayer with NetPlay, scrape box art anywhere, download Portmaster games, and even play online games like PokeMMO. And you'd also be surprised about the amount of handhelds that don't have Wi-Fi built in these days. A lot of them need dongles, and having it just right on the device itself, you can't take it for granted. But you know what's an amazing experience? MuOS, aka Mustard OS. MuOS is a custom firmware that's excellent for Anbernic XX devices. So after having a miserable experience with Ruggedness, I came crawling back to my old pal MuOS. I don't know if they have an official build for the 34XXSP yet, so I downloaded a custom build and it runs perfectly. Analog sticks work great, the screen looks great, and the operating system itself is so mature. I've been using a theme called 1.2. I forget where I found it. I think it was like a MuOS theme website or something. It just kind of fits the vibe. I really like it. Overall, the quality of the 34XXSP is pretty good. It doesn't exactly stand out as a beacon of ingenuity, but for a solid budget handheld, you can't really go wrong with this one. Now we've covered a ton in this review so far, so let's break it down to my pros, mids, and cons. For pros, we have the small clamshell form factor. This thing is pretty compact. Then we have very satisfying and tactile D-pad and ABXY buttons. Another pro is the control options. Just like the MiU Flip, this thing has a lot of controls, so it's pretty flexible for a small handheld. The next pro is Portmaster support, especially with the 2 GB of RAM. It allows us to play a ton of ports, with the caveat of installing a custom firmware like MuOS. Next up is the Hinge. This is a very solid, high quality hinge that is extremely fluid and it doesn't feel cheap. Speaking of cheap, the next pro is the quality. This thing is surprisingly high quality. It's certainly not at the top of the totem pole, but this is a very solid option when it comes to quality for the price. Now let's move over to mids. That could swing either way depending on your preferences. First mid would be the display. It's pretty saturated, it gets kind of bright, but not really. It doesn't stand out, but it doesn't fall flat either. Speaking of the screen, it has a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is pretty divisive. It's perfect for Game Boy Advance games and Portmaster games that fill the entire screen. But when you bring bezels into the mix and pillar boxing like PlayStation 1 or Super Nintendo, it kind of gets a little squirrely and it feels like a compromised experience. In dead center of the list, we have the performance. This is an XX device, so it has the exact same performance as every other Anbernic device with an XX in the name. You know, it's not the same as every other Anbernic XX device is the analog sticks. While these aren't the best analog sticks, they are sticks. They're fine, and they're there, which is more than the 35XXSP, and I guess is a welcome addition, maybe? Really depends on you. And finally, this handheld feels like a safe bet. We get a lot of custom firmware options, but we've also seen this device and performance on 11 other Anbernic handhelds. It just doesn't have that X factor, which is a bit ironic given the XX in the name. I guess they cancel each other out. Moving over to cons, we have a very big bezel. Some call it a 5-head, I call it a 12-head because this thing is comically large, and while it's not the biggest bezel on planet Earth, it's pretty big. And also, this is a handheld that satisfies a niche, not the majority of people. Luckily, if you're in this niche, then this is the handheld for you, and you'll know too by just looking at it. It's very much what you see is what you get. And then there's the hinge. While it's very good quality, it only has a single hinge point. Now there's still friction in the middle section, so you can play it on a table, but the actual hinge snap is just a singular point. Going back to the thumbsticks, they're pretty crampy. That's just kind of a result of the form factor and squeezing analog sticks in a very compact form, but they're crampy nonetheless. And finally, for the record, smaller is not always better. Now, I don't usually say this. I think that small is very good and powerful too, you know? But in this case, the smaller screen and more compact profile might not be as comfortable for some people. While it is more portable, you sacrifice on other things, so it's a toss-up. Now, I've had some mixed feelings on this device, but honestly, I think it's a very solid option if you're looking for a quality, portable clamshell handheld. And because of that, I am giving this handheld the inaugural It's Pretty Good award. You earned it, little fella. The RG34XXSP is definitely an Anbernic handheld, through and through. A tasteful, yet divisive, twist on the tried and true formula. Is this the best clamshell option available? In some ways, yeah, but is it the perfect clamshell? Well, no. Because if it was the perfect one, then I'd probably be playing it instead of making this video. But most importantly of all, is this the right handheld for you? Well, hopefully you have a better idea now. And if you want to pick one up, there's a link in the description. And if you use it, it supports me at no extra cost to you. So thank you as always for hanging out with me and getting to know the aptly named RG34XXSP. Man, I just wish they call it the flipper or something, you know? So are you looking to pick up a flipper? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked the video, go ahead and like the video and subscribe for more reviews, handheld news, and tutorials on how to use them. I'm Montotech, and I'm also out of here. Later. If you liked the video, you should check out my review of the RG34XX. This is the non-SP model that's made after the original Game Boy Advance. It's extremely comfortable, and it has a lot of charm to it. You can check out that video here.